Recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's my privilege and honor to address you here on the floor of the House of Representatives. And I would say at the outset that it is also my honor and privilege to have been seated here on the floor of the House of Representatives. If I listened to Congressman and Judge Ted Poe address you on the brave patriots from Texas that were on the poster, and as he went down through, I'll say, a choice morsel of each individual's life and what happened in their sacrifice, and talked to us about the values that they defended and the reasons that they have put their lives on the line. I'm impressed by the honor that Ted Poe did to those who have given their lives from Texas, and I'm very convinced that he would agree with me that he'd appreciate it if that honor could be reflected across all of the brave patriots who have given their lives in the defense of this country in this conflict and in past conflicts. And we always pray that there be no future conflicts. Mr. Speaker, I came to the floor to address a different subject matter, and perhaps I'll digress across over into the national security side of this. But I find that I don't believe any member of any delegation has yet come to the floor to talk about the natural disaster events that have been taking place in the Midwest, and in particular in the Missouri River Basin area. And I'm one who has grown up in that drainage basin area. I've lived there on that side of the Great Divide for most of my life. And we have some circumstances today that eclipse the 500-year flood event of 1996. In 96, more water came down the Missouri River than ever before. That was the largest amount of cubic feet per second and the largest amount of over 1 million acre feet that had come down. I will say there was a couple of events that would compete with that depending on how you define it, Mr. Speaker, and one of them would be a flood in 1943 that brought the attention of the world, and we were in the middle of a world war. We didn't get to addressing the massive runoff in the Missouri River from the 43 flood event. In 1952, the huge floods came again, and more water for a single month came down the Missouri River than ever before or since. And that amounted to a discharge, in million acre feet of 13.2 million acre feet of water came down in a single month, the month of April 1952. That, of course, flooded everything and put the water higher than it had been before, and it brought the attention of this Congress. And the attention of this Congress, paying particular attention to what happened in the flood event in 52, followed through on some plans that had been discussed after the 1943 flood, and they began to take action and to move forward for the construction of what we now know as the Pick-Sloan program. Pick-Sloan program is the construction of 6 large dams on the upper Missouri River, and it starts at Gavin's Point Dam in South Dakota, and it goes on up to Fort Randall Dam, Oahe, and then on up into South Dakota, or into North Dakota, where you see Garrison Dam and Fort Peck. I left out Big Bend. So we have Gavin's Point, Fort Randall, Big Bend, Oahe, Garrison Dam, and then Fort Peck Dam. These are all built on the main stem of the Missouri River, but they collect water from all the tributaries. And the water that we have now coming down through the Midwest, that comes down through out of Montana into North Dakota, where it's flooding now, and flooding also across South Dakota, all across the bottoms, and spilling out of the 6 dams one after another in discharge rates higher than we've seen in sustained rates ever before. The most water to come down the river since these 6 dams were built in Pick-Sloan program, starting in the 50s and finishing in the early 60s. The discharge level at Gavin's Point Dam, which is the lowest one, that's at Yankton, South Dakota, is now approaching 160,000 cubic feet per second. That's more discharge than we've seen before. And the result of this is we're in a flood stage all down this river in the areas that I've mentioned, and from below the dams, the Missouri River is at flood stage. Some of it has just not yet arrived at St. Louis in its peak form. But because of this, it has flooded some of our communities, and it has flooded hundreds of thousands of acres of our farmland. It's caused us to build many miles of levees that some design as temporary and some would describe as permanent, and some of them I hope do stay permanent. the water is going to be semi-permanent. This is not, Mr. Speaker, a short-term flood event that just happened because the clouds opened up and it gushed down into the river, and it's going to wash by us and be gone in a few days like many floods are. This is a long-term national disaster flood event for the entire Missouri River Basin, all the way from Montana to St. Louis, Missouri. This is the highest water level that we have seen since the Pick Sloan program was built. And in some places, it's the highest water we've ever seen. It'll certainly be the longest term that will be underwater that has ever been. And so as I travel up and down the river, and I have the privilege, Mr. Speaker, of representing all of the Missouri River that Iowa touches, that would be from the Sioux City area where the Missouri River comes out of South Dakota and joins up and provides the border. The western border of Iowa, between Iowa and Nebraska, is all Missouri River. Nebraskans on one side, Iowans on the other side, both of us underwater on both sides of the river. It's also true in South Dakota. But the water that's coming down the river in this massive quantity has brought about a lot of criticism and a lot of scrambling. First, I want to say, Mr. Speaker, that the events that brought us to this are unprecedented in modern recorded history in this, that of all of the area that the Pick Sloan program handles, all of the drainage area of the Missouri River, and the upper Missouri River in particular, we watch, the Corps of Engineers watches the precipitation, they watch the snow cap, and they anticipate how much water they will have. We've gone through at least an 8-year record drought in the upper Missouri River, so that these reservoirs, these 6 huge reservoirs that were not designed for the primary purpose at all of fishing and recreation, but were designed for flood control and navigation and electrical generation, and also to cool our generators where we have coal-fired generators along the river, and for navigation. These reservoirs have been very, very valuable to the states, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Montana, because the tourism industry for recreation and fishing has so migrated to those beautiful areas that they have. When they're out of water, when the pool drains down during an 8-year drought, which they have had, it might be 3/4 of a mile from where your dock was, where your boat was tied up, to where the water actually is. And we've engaged in a struggle here on the floor of the House of Representatives about who gets the water when there was a short water supply. Congressman Denny Rehberg has tried mightily to keep as much water up in Montana when they needed it as possible. I found myself in disagreement with him trying to get the water down the river so we had enough to cool our generators, float our boats, and bring some barge traffic up and provide for flood control. And so the 8-year drought is over, Mr. Speaker. It's completely over. And it was actually over the last year and a half or so, as the water levels in these 6 dams, that, thinking of them as 6 huge bathtubs that are nearly dry, the water level in the 6 huge dams has been coming up over the last year and a half or more. And as of last fall, it caught up to the design pool elevations, and then they had enough rain in the upper Missouri that it overfilled these 6 dams. The Corps of Engineers, operating under the Master Manual Guidelines, which is the playbook that they have to manage these 6 dams by, lowered the pool elevations in the dams so that they had storage to be prepared for any future floods. They're required under the Master Manual to manage these levels so that they have 16.3 million acre-feet of storage capacity to manage the flood. They drew it down to that level, those normal pool elevations, I will call them. They did so over the wintertime, and that was fine throughout November, December, January, February, and early March. Stability within those pool levels, storage capacity of 16.3 million acre-feet. They're prepared for spring rains. They're prepared for the snow runoff. That's manageable. And then, in very, very late March and in early April, heavy snows in the mountains began. And the snowpack began to build in the mountains, and that couldn't have been anticipated, to 140% of the anticipated volume of snow that would have to, of course, melt and come down the Missouri River. In addition to that, they had spring rains across the upper Missouri Basin, across the plains and the foothills of the mountains, and those spring rains flowed down into the reservoirs and overfilled them as well. And once that had happened, it was a situation where the storage capacity in the reservoirs was diminished significantly, And an unusual event took place on May 22nd. That's when Billings, Montana got 8 inches of rain, and some of the other areas got 10 and 12 inches of rain. It was across a vast area of the upper Missouri Basin, and as that water came down into the reservoirs, the Corps of Engineers began to watch the rain gauges and the runoff and conclude that they had a rare event, an event that the Pick-Sloan program was not designed to handle with ease. And they announced to us on that day, May 22nd, that they would open up the gates of the dams so that the lowest one at Gavin's Point at Yankton, South Dakota, which is the one we watch for all the flow of the rest of the river, that they would be flowing at 110,000 cubic feet per second. That was May 22nd or early May 23rd. By the 26th of May, the Corps of Engineers had evaluated the flow rates in the tributaries and the rainfall reports that they had and the forecast, and announced that they had to increase that flow to 150,000 cubic feet per second. That makes a tremendous difference, Mr. Speaker, because the result of that necessary decision that the Corps of Engineers made was that the water tables would go up, the water levels would go up in the river above flood stage for what turns out to be almost the entire flow, and maybe actually the entire flow of the Missouri River downstream from the dams, and also the flow that's coming through upstream from the dams is flooding significant areas, residential areas, commercial property areas, ag land in vast amounts, all the way up through the Dakotas and Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, and some spilling over into Kansas. That's the situation that we have. When I go back and look at this, and I should say also, Mr. Speaker, that my life's work has been the earth-moving business. We've gone in and built levees and dug ditches and built terraces and waterways and dams. We bid work on the Missouri River, flood control work on the Missouri River. I've watched the flows, studied the flows, floated the river for recreational purposes and engineering reasons. And I've dealt as a state senator in Iowa for 6 years and now a member of Congress into my 9th year with the public policies that have to do with the water coming down the river and the species that are affected by it. All of this together, if I look back upon it and try to become a Monday morning quarterback, Mr. Speaker, I'll come to this conclusion, that yes, knowing what we know today, it would have been possible to prevent this long-term flooding that we have in the Missouri River bottom. But that's knowing what we know today. The Corps of Engineers could not have known that they were going to get the heavy snowfalls that would come down on the mountains that would be melting even now. Perhaps half of that snow is melted today and the balance of it has to still melt. They couldn't have known that until the snow actually arrived in late March and earlier April. Neither could they have known that there would be this huge unseasonal rain that would run off to the extent that it did and saturate the soil so that the big rain that hit Billings, as I mentioned, would run off to the extent that it did. But once they knew about the flows coming in, they made the decision that they had to make, Mr. Speaker. And we are where we are. Now, we're watching 160,000 cubic feet per second come out of Gavin's Point. That's more than ever before. The water table is above the flood stage all the way along the Missouri River from below Gavin's Point, and I presume that the gentleman who represents North Dakota and the gentlelady that represents South Dakota can speak to those issues up there, and I imagine that they can say that they have floods all the way up and down the Missouri River bottom completely from throughout the Dakotas and likely Montana. But, Mr. Speaker, these water levels are going to stay, and they're going to stay for all of the rest of June, likely all the rest of July, and partway into August, most likely. And in fact, these water levels could stay into September or October, depending on whether we get unseasonably high rains. If we do, if there's additional rain to this, then these water levels, or even on the outside, higher water levels, could be with us for a long time to come on into the fall. The people that live in these states that I have mentioned have to live with high water for a long period of time. Not like a tornado that comes and blows away your homes and your businesses and allows you to go back when the sun comes out and start to clean up the mess and rebuild. This flood is not like a tornado, not like a hurricane. It's not even like a flood, a normal flood. A normal flood will come up and wash over you and wash away some things and soak the rest, and the water table will go down. Even on the Mississippi River, where the water comes up slow and goes down slow, this eclipses the duration of any flood that I know. In that, the Corps of Engineers, without a lot of choice, by June 14th, this month, June 14th, had opened up the gates to 150,000 cubic feet per second. Now, as of about today, 160,000 cubic feet per second. And that discharge, that volume of water that floods the Missouri River bottom, I'll say completely, will continue to be with us for 2 months, perhaps more. That's unprecedented in duration. It's unprecedented in volume. This is more water than has ever come down the Missouri River in a year that we know of since we've been recording these records. I said 16.3 million acre feet of storage capacity that they have, but the projected flow out of the Missouri River for this year is 54 million acre feet, and that's more than even came down in the 1993 floods, which was a 500-year flood event, or at least described to be the same. I lived under that, Mr. Speaker. It flooded 4 of my major projects and changed my life. And the long story I won't tell here, but I might not be in this Congress had it not been for the 1993 flood, which completely redirected my life. This flood is redirecting the lives of thousands of people up and down the Missouri River bottom. It's changing businesses. It's changing residences. I'm convinced, Mr. Speaker, that we will lose businesses over the long term, and we will lose people over the long term who can't get back into their homes. To give an example, and it's the South Dakota example in the Dakota Dunes. It is a region that was built around a golf course, the Dakota Dunes Golf Course, just outside of Iowa, outside of the North Sioux City side, which is some might call it a suburb of Sioux City itself. But in that area, people that had, I'll say, wherewithal and vision developed an area in there for residences, and it's a very nice area. It's close to the river. The nicer the homes, the closer the river they seem to be. And when the Corps of Engineers announced on May 26th that these discharge levels would be coming down the river, they went to work with private money and began building a temporary levee alongside the Missouri River to protect their homes. This is a neighborhood coming together with their checkbooks to do emergency work to protect their homes. And while they were doing that, the Corps of Engineers led an emergency contract to build a levee that protects about half of the homes in that area, but it is not stable enough for them to build that levee to protect all of the homes. And so you have 2 levees, one private money, good homes protecting themselves, another one Corps of Engineers money to protect the balance of those homes. If we lose that levee near the river, about half of the homes in the Dakota Dunes, and probably the nicest homes, will be under a massive amount of water. And as I was up there to visit, they were building this temporary levee. And Mr. Speaker, I spent my life in the construction business, specifically the earth-moving business. We've had a fair number of our own machines running at a single time. But this operation in that area of the Dakota Dunes, our small population area, had 170 trucks hauling dirt into these temporary levees, about 50 trucks hauling into the Corps of Engineers levee, 120 trucks hauling into the private money levee that was there. Most of them belly dumps and side dumps, semi-size, not little short straight trucks, but big trucks with a full load of dirt on each one of them, building the levee as the river comes up. We've done that they've done it in South Dakota. They've done that in the Iowa side and also on the Nebraska side of the Missouri River, where we built several miles of levees around our critical companies and critical infrastructure. CF Industries, which is a fertilizer company, built a levee about 0.8 of a mile long, and then all the way around their plant, put in about 14 to 16 wells with pumps in them to dewater the inside of their levee as the river runs around the outside. That's true also with the protein company that's there, and they have been protecting the generating plants with sandbagging and pumps and temporary levees. And as you go on down the river, Nebraska, Omaha has its story, Council Bluffs has its story. They're protected by a pretty good Corps of Engineers levee, but the water's high, and these levees are not built for 2 months of high water and fast flows and turbulence up against these levees. So they have to be monitored 24/7 all the way through until the water goes down. And if there's a little boil, somebody's got to be there to fix that. Or as happened down in the southwest corner of Iowa, we can lose a levee in a matter of just a minute or two. I know that there was a levee that ended up that almost spontaneously had a 30-foot boil in it where the earth just disappeared. And then a little bit later it was 200 feet long, then it was 300 feet long, then it couldn't be repaired any longer. And the backup levee is what's protecting the city of Hamburg right now. There has been a courageous effort, Mr. Speaker, on the part of Midwesterners to build the temporary facilities they could in the short notice that they had. When you think that the Thursday before Memorial Weekend is when the word came from the Corps of Engineers that these historically high flows would be released. And it takes a couple of days for that water to get down. Of course, they weren't going to peak out on this until June 14th. But they had maybe 2 weeks to be ready for the highest water, and they had to get ready while the water was coming up, sometimes a foot a day. They've done a phenomenal job. And as I go into the emergency command centers in places like Sioux City, Council Bluffs, Iowa, as I go into the little town of Blencoe, Iowa, 270 people there in the flat bottom of the Missouri River who had been told that they would see 2 to 3 feet of water everywhere in their town and there wasn't going to be a way to save the town. They looked around and said, what do we do? Do we let all of our property flood and stay underwater for a couple of months? And 5 contractors came together and put 11 machines on the job, and a few days later they had built 5 miles of levee that goes all the way around the mighty little city of Blencoe and ties it back in together, and they have pumps sitting there, and they're protecting themselves from the flood. And that little Blencoe doesn't need to be the Alamo to the flood of 2011. They can fight this flood off, and we want to be there to help them all that we can. I have a business owner that builds trailers in Missouri Valley, Iowa. He had gone in and bought a business in downtown Missouri Valley a few years ago, and because of the floods from the 90s, built a new location above the floodplain just on the outside of town by the Interstate 29, which, by the way, is closed today because of the floodwaters covering the interstate highway. And, Mr. Speaker, he built a new plant above the floodplain so that he didn't have to be flooded out again. And about 3 years ago, there was a quirk of weather, and one of the major streams backed up and flooded his new plant. And he's one of the top trailer salespeople in America. Flooded his new plant with about 4 or 5 feet of water and destroyed some of his property that was in there. He picked his chin back up and went to work and cleaned up the mess and fixed the trailers that he could fix and junked the rest and started all over and put a smile back on his face and said, that's life, isn't it? And went to work in a courageous American way. Now his plant that is built above the flood stage and was flooded 2 or 3 years ago is back under risk, and I can't confirm today that it's underwater, but they predict it will be under 4 feet of water. And he's moved his equipment back down to the old plant. He's moved from the non-flood zone to the flood zone where the old plant was, where they predict that one won't be underwater, but his new plant that's out of the flood stage will be underwater. The irony of all of this is not lost on him, nor is it lost on me. Sometimes whatever you do, it's just going to end up to be wrong. This time, we have a lot of people that are suffering that maybe have done everything that they can do to protect themselves. We have farmsteads, Mr. Speaker, that are completely flooded, and we have hundreds of them that are underwater. All up and down on the west side of the Interstate 29 in the southwest corner of Iowa, we've evacuated some 600 homes because they're all going underwater. The little town of Percival and 2 other small towns in that area are now been announced that they will be underwater and flooded, and I hesitate to report exactly where that water is now. I'm going tonight, and by the weekend I will have looked at all that again, Mr. Speaker. But the water that we have is unprecedented. It's strange in its nature in that floodwaters we see as silty, muddy water that's full of mud and silt and junk. Some of this is. Maybe 40% of this water is silt-laden water. But more than half of it, perhaps 60%, Mr. Speaker, is clear water. And when you fly over it and you look down, you can see through that water, and you can see the striping on Interstate 29. You can see corn stalks, corn stem, little sprouted plants that grew up about this far before the water flooded them, and they're standing there underneath 1.5 or 2 feet of clear water. And it goes on, bean stubble the same way. Little pictures, you'll see also irrigation systems standing out in the water in 8 feet of water, an irrigation system standing there. But this clear water that has emerged comes because the pressure from the river, the hydrostatic pressure of the river, pushes down on the entire aquifer around there. And as it pushes down, the weight of that water seeks its own level, so the silt and flood water pushes down into the soil, and when it does that, water equalizes and it comes up out of the ground, sometimes on the other side of the levee, on the east side of the interstate, in my case, where clear water, it would be like what kind of water you'd find in drainage tile or well, comes up and sits on the surface everywhere. Clear and clean as can be, shutting down our transportation units, our interstate highway, and flooding family farms and businesses all up and down this river, and the most of it has yet to reach St. Louis. This is a problem for all the way across Missouri, from St. Louis all the way up into St. Joe and north. It's a problem for the entire Missouri River bottom, Nebraska, Iowa, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Montana. And to put it in perspective also, Mr. Speaker, the flow coming down this river, when people think that the Corps of Engineers could have done something different, marginally they could have, as I said, but they would have had to have been clairvoyant, and they would have had to violate the terms of the master manual. But the flow coming down the river at 150,000 cubic feet per second happens to be the amount of water that's just coming out of the Yellowstone River itself. So of those people that want to turn these American rivers back to what they were before we managed them and controlled them and built the Pick Sloan program, I'd ask you all, Mr. Speaker, to think, if 150,000 cubic feet per second is flowing out of the Yellowstone River, and it is, and 150,000 cubic feet per second is flowing past out of Gavin's Point and passed down through Sioux City, if the Pick Sloan program had not been built, if we had no dams in the Missouri River, if all of the tributaries of the Missouri River were completely dry, except for the Yellowstone River, that little tributary up there in Montana, we'd still have the same amount of water there right now. It wouldn't last as long, but it'd be as high as the levels we have today. That's how much this helps us. We know those other tributaries are flowing a lot of water. There's a massive amount. It's more than ever before. It's 54 million acre feet for this year, and it was a 500-year event in 1993. This is a 550-year event today. So, Mr. Speaker, I have called upon the President to declare this entire area a national disaster area. I know that Governor Branstad has made that request. I know that the governors in some of the states, such as Nebraska and Montana, have made that request. I believe that that request has been granted in a couple of cases, not yet for Iowa. I know that Governor Branstad has made this request for Iowa, and I thank the entire Iowa congressional delegation for joining with me in a letter to President Obama and making the request that he declare this a national disaster. We have a long time to be working with this water. A lot of sandbags have been filled. Some more will be filled. Many have to be emptied when this water goes down. And the quality that we are going to need the most is the prayers of the American people and perseverance. And so, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate your attention to this matter. I appreciate the Iowa delegation for standing with me and the delegations up and down the river who have stood together. And we need to stand with the people whose property is underwater and help them get through this. They are stoic people. They're determined people. They're not going to be standing there complaining. They're going to be doing all they can to help themselves. And to honor their effort, I and others are determined to do all we can to help them. So that is the update on the 2011 flood, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate your attention, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair would be pleased to entertain a motion.